Pleasure to see you in the chair today. Investment in education is one of my priorities for North Cornwall, and of special interest to me personally as someone who is a champion for social mobility. North Cornwall is a prime example of an area that has been historically overlooked compared with other urban areas from governments of all colours over the past 50 years, to the detriment of the life chances of young people and children who grow up in this beautiful part of the country. I'd like to start by talking about the London Challenge, the policy which saw huge investment in urban areas in the country back in 2003. Although it's difficult to isolate the impact of the policy, it's undeniable the attainment levels went up when the overall funding packages in those areas were introduced. The policy saw a budget of £40 million a year for London, Greater Manchester and the Black Country at its peak. My issue is that the children of Llanlivet, Launceston and Bodmin could have and should have had the same resources at that same time, and they would have benefited from the uplift. I mentioned the London Challenge because despite the policy coming to an end, there is a huge disparity between educational investment in urban and rural areas. Cornwall is part of a group of 42 local authorities which have historically received some of the lowest allocations for primary and secondary pupils across the whole country, and I'm here today to talk on behalf of the head teachers that have spoken to me about their concerns. Of course.
And he makes a very important point about the London Challenge, which was a very successful investment, but the legacy of which is that huge gap between per capita funding for pupils in our constituencies. Will you agree with me that coastal constituencies like his and mine, where there are pockets of deprivation, need a similar sort of scheme in order to recognise the deprivation and advantage there, just as we did in London, but in a different way?
The Honourable Member is absolutely right. Rural deprivation is very much harder to differentiate, and whilst urban deprivation tends to be easier to identify, it definitely does exist and should be recognised in the funding formula. Cornwall is one of the most beautiful places to raise a child. It's safe, uniquely beautiful with the landscape. Children are really lucky to grow up there. However, when it comes to education, I believe that they've been shortchanged over the years. Having been a PPS previously in the Treasury, I understand the cost pressures of maintaining stable economic policy and ensuring stable growth and limiting borrowing and allowing us to live within our means. But if there is one sector that needs urgent investment in this spending review, Minister, it's your department. The further education and secondary and primary education. And that means revisiting some of the policies that we've looked at previously, the minimum per pupil funding levels, the 0.5 funding floor, and the historic differences for the schools which have been comparatively well funded over several decades. Moreover, there is an issue with historic averages being used, and therefore locking the disparity gap between the highest funded state schools and the lowest funded state schools can be between 50 and 70%. Cornwall schools are particularly penalised, and I felt this has been unfair. For me, the question is simply one of fairness. Fairness for the taxpayers, fairness for the teachers, and fairness for the children and the young people. Parents in North Cornwall pay the same level of tax pro rata as parents in the cities, yet historically their children have received only half the educational investment from the state that the pupils in urban areas have. Whilst the fair funding mechanisms have helped, they are not happening fast enough, and this rebalancing needs to happen much, much faster. As I mentioned earlier, one of my passions has pushed me to stand for election is social mobility. More parity and fairness in the education system will allow social mobility to increase in North Cornwall. I cannot stand here and argue for social mobility whilst this disparity exists. More investment leads to higher attainment, and it provides teachers with the resources they need to teach their pupils. We saw that with the extra funding that went into London, with the larger budgets, those attainment gaps shrunk. In an increasing technological-based jobs market, rural pupils need to have the same level of funding to obtain the same level of skills needed to fit into that marketplace. They need to be given the fairest deal they can from this government to develop their academic and vocational skills. North Cornwall's pupils are no less talented, aspirational, ambitious or intelligent than the pupils from urban areas, but they have historically received less funding from every colour of government that has been in the last 50 years, and that needs to change. a fairer national funding formula that's not based on disparity between urban and rural areas, but unlocks the talent of every child in this country. So on behalf of the schools in North Cornwall, I'm asking for a fairer deal, Minister, and to show a show of confidence in our young people in North Cornwall. It's not simply a question of more investment after years of sustained economic and budgetary growth, but a reallocation of funds across the whole of the area, ensuring that every pupil, no matter where they live, from Cornwall to Scotland and everywhere in between, is treated exactly the same way. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I strongly believe that schools in rural areas like mine should get a fairer deal in the spending review, and I would urge the Minister to strengthen every synergy when he speaks to the Treasury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.